Hi, I'm Deanna Springer. On behalf of Nancy Zieman Productions and PBS Wisconsin, welcome to the virtual Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. Enjoy this educational presentation, and afterward, be sure to explore all the virtual event has to offer, including beautiful virtual quilt exhibits, an interactive vendor mall, and more. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the show.
Hi, I'm Pam Maschey with Bernina USA. I'm here today to share with you some great ways of using some overlock stitches, maybe in a basic way, but you know me, I can't just stop at basic. So I'm going to show you some very creative ways too of using those basic overlock stitches and maybe a chain or cover stitch too. Now let's take a look at some of the basic stitches and how you may apply them or use them in your project. The first we're going to look at is a 4-thread overlock stitch. With that 4-thread stitch, you're going to find that you have 2 needle threads, and you have both your upper looper thread and your lower looper thread to form that stitch. Now you may look at this and say, wow, that looks like a really wide stitch. But what you're able to do is adjust the width of your stitch down to 1/4 of an inch, an exact 1/4 of an inch stitch. Because I know all of you quilters are really interested in learning how to use your machine for fast sewing speed and accurate 1/4 inch piecing. Now there are some techniques that we're going to look at in just a little bit that you might say, well, I don't know if I can use my overlock for that. And there are many applications that you may not want to use your overlock machine in. But when we get to long strips and piecing, speed is important and also accuracy is important. So we're going to look at on the machine in a minute exactly how that's going to be done and how you can adjust the stitch to 1/4 of an inch. Now when you look at the stitch, you might also wonder, why would we use a 3-thread stitch instead of the 4-thread stitch? So when we look at this sample, you'll also notice that we've used just 3 threads, both in a little wider setting. This again is our 1/4 of an inch setting, and this is even a little narrower setting. When you work with a 3-thread stitch, the 3-thread stitch would allow for your seam to be a little bit more full, and we'll look more at the machine again. And when we're working with heavier fabrics, you may prefer 4 threads over 3 threads, but again, it just depends how you like your stitch and your seam allowance to look. The other stitch that I have here is a stitch that you may look at and say, well, that looks just like a stitch on my sewing machine. And I'm going to flip it over because it might be a little harder to see because it's yellow on this fabric. On the back side, you'll see that we have a chain stitch. Now that chain stitch, just like it works on your sewing machine, you can have a stitch that's flat. You could press a seam allowance open if you wanted to. So when you look at setting your machine, you can set it whether you're wanting to have a straight stitch or you're wanting to use an overlock stitch for your different sewing applications. You might also wonder what happens when I'm going to do any stitching for quilting with the piecing of our projects. I just showed you using a 4-thread overlock stitch. This quilt was actually strip pieced together using a 4-thread stitch, and then the long arm stitching was placed right on top of our quilt. It does not add any extra bulk at all when you're going to be using a 4-thread overlock to join your strips together. If you're going to be concerned about any bulk, you may want to use that chain stitch that I showed you earlier. This quilt, as well as this quilt, were both gifted to me from Nancy Zieman and are from her book, Quick Column Quilts. This quilt in particular is also a quilt as you go project or technique that is used, and I'm going to show you a way of using a 4-thread overlock for Quilt As You Go, and you're going to find that it greatly reduces the bulk that you have in your seams. So let's come on over to the machine and take a look at how we're going to be setting up our machine for making these different stitches. All right, so let's take a look at the Bernina 890 machine that we're going to be working on. You're going to look at the machine itself and say, are you really sitting in front of an overlock machine? This is our newest machine in the line, and I absolutely love it. You're going to find that when you come to the screen, you're going to have different types of stitches that you can choose from right on the screen itself. So we're going to start with the overlock stitch. So I'll just simply select overlock, and I'm going to select 4-thread overlock stitching. All of your stitches are indicated here on this touch screen, and you can select any of those stitches. But we're going to go to a 4-thread overlock stitch. Here it will give us the settings that we're going to need for the different settings of pressure on your presser foot or your stitch width. Now remember earlier I said that our stitch width was going to be set at 5.5. So we set our cutting width and stitch width at 5.5 to give us that accurate 1/4 of an inch stitch. Now, when I'm ready to thread, all I need to do is thread the needles, which are already threaded, and I'm going to thread the loopers. And now I've used all the same color threads. That's the way you would be stitching on your project as well. So to thread, I'm just simply going to place the thread into the ports and nozzles and just send that thread through for both my upper and lower looper. Now once I have that set, all I need to do is close everything up and I'm ready to sew. So I simply take my strips of fabric and I'm going to rest them in front of the presser foot. Now your feed dogs are long enough so that it will pick up the edge of that fabric and feed it through. You'll also notice that there's a small notch that's there on the presser foot. I'm going to talk about the raised marks guides in just a minute. But the little recessed notch that's there is actually the marking for your cutting blade, which is a great place to position your fabric as you're guiding it in. So as I stitch, because it's set at 1/4 of an inch, I'm simply guiding my fabric in, skimming the edge of the fabric, for that 1/4 of an inch stitch. Okay? Now, that's a basic way of using your machine for piecing and putting your projects together. But what happens if you're going to be working with the Quilt As You Go, as we mentioned earlier? The Quilt As You Go is a technique that, of course, we start with your backing fabric, your batting fabric, and then the front. Okay? And we layer those all together. Now when we set the next piece of fabric, we're going to be placing right sides to right sides. Then I like to place my piece of batting right on top. And then we're going to flip this over and take our backing piece, and again, it's right sides together for the backing. So now you're going to have 6 layers, a sandwich that you've created on your seam. You do also have pressure adjustment. So I can adjust the pressure on my presser foot to accommodate for that added thickness. And as I raise the presser foot and slide the fabric under, I want to rest it right against that mark again that we have on the presser foot. So now as we stitch, you'll be able to see that it's accommodating that added thickness. And after I get this stitched out, I'm going to show you the stitch. Now let's take take a look at this stitch. This stitch, the 4-thread stitch, is actually going to compress. Remember earlier I mentioned how a 4-thread stitch will compress your seam? So this 4-thread stitch with all of those layers is now compressing the seam allowance so that when we open the back layer, oops, let me separate that because we have 2 strips here. Okay, so now when I open this up, I have a flatter seam where I've joined together, and it might be a little easier to see it on this side because of that lighter colored fabric. But here my seam is going to be much flatter. If I would choose to do a 3-thread stitch, before I add the other strip, what I'm going to do is simply finish the edge so that it's joining together all 3 layers. Many times what will happen is when you're stitching, and you'll see it happened right here. See how I missed one of those layers of fabric? To prevent that, what I like to do is simply stitch, narrowing my stitch width, narrow down your stitch width, and just simply stitch right along the edge. So now that I have this stitched, it's going to be much easier for me to place right sides together, back to back, back strip to back strip. You're going to place right sides together on the front, and again, place your batting on top of all of those layers. Okay? Then simply move your stitch width back to that setting of 5.5, which is going to give us that 1/4 inch stitch. And here, if you would prefer then to use a 3-thread stitch, you could simply cut the needle thread for the right needle, slide that thread out, and what I'm going to do is select a 3-thread stitch. So I have a 3-thread overlock stitch that I'm going to select for a wide 3-thread stitch. Okay. 3-thread wide overlock. So now it's already adjusted any of the settings that I would need, and I have all of those layers together. And with that 3-thread, as I stitch, it's going to again encase the edge, but I don't have the bulkiness because I've already compressed the seam using the 4-thread stitch. Okay, keep your layers even as you stitch. And you may also want to increase your stitch length just a little bit on the machine when you're working with all of these layers and thicknesses so that it does feed through. What you don't want to do is as you stitch on your overlock machines, you don't want to pull the fabric through. Just let the machine feed it for you. So here I've simply used that 3-thread stitch to join the layers together, and when I open my seam, because I had finished those layers together, I know I've caught all the layers and I have condensed that seam. If I would choose to use a 3-thread stitch only and join another strip together, what would happen is my seam would actually be thicker and it would have more loft to it. All right, so now you would have this quilt as you go technique, super easy and fast. And the Quick Column Quilt Book is a great way and a great book to use when you're wanting to make a quick quilt to give as a baby gift. Now, when we look at the 3 threads, since we're on a 3-thread stitch, you know me, I just can't wait to show you some decorative ways to use your 3-thread stitch. So here's an example of using that 3-thread stitch that I'm on right now on the machine, but using some decorative thread. So by using decorative thread in your loopers will really enhance the look of that stitch. Whether you're wanting to use it on the seam itself, or if you're wanting to use it for some decorative work, maybe on a binding. We'll show you that in a minute too. But I do want to share with you this. So as you're stitching, when you work with decorative thread has different weights to it. And with these different weights, you're going to find heavier, thick threads. And remember, the higher the number, the thinner the thread. Okay, low number, thick thread. So this is an 8-weight thread, and that's what I use to stitch on this sample. So when I stitch with this, if my stitch length is too close together, you'll see that the thread kind of bunches up and it doesn't lay very nice. Lengthen your stitch and your stitches will lay smoother between each of the stitches that are formed, and you're also going to be able to have a much more attractive looking stitch. Whether it's going to be this 9mm wide stitch or it's going to be the narrower. This is that 5.5 stitch width that we've been working with for our seaming. But by using a decorative thread, you'll see that it gives you a completely different look to that stitch. And that's really attractive. Texture is also very important when you're doing your quilting. So I mentioned this is a 8-weight thread. Okay, you see how thick that thread is. There are also threads that you can work with, and I would recommend you start with using a 12-weight thread. So this 12-weight thread is going to give you a nice decorative edge, but you're not having to make accommodations for the thread itself. And it will feed directly through the machine when you're threading. And we'll show you that in just a minute. So that was a very sparkly metallic thread. On the quilt that you see hanging in the back, we used a 2-thread stitch and we used a 12-weight thread again. And with this 12-weight thread, it is in either the needle or in the looper itself. That's going to give you a very decorative stitch too. There's also other types of threads that you might have in your box to experiment with. Just keep in mind that when you're working with these decorative threads, that they typically will go in your looper when you're working with a 3-thread decorative stitch. I want to show you how you can use this decorative thread in your loopers and create a binding edge. This is something I think you're really going to enjoy seeing. So I'm simply going to clip my threads for both the upper and lower looper, raise the presser foot, and I'm just going to slide the threads out from behind. Okay. And I'm going to replace them with the decorative threads. So I'll place one in my lower looper and one in my upper looper. Okay. And I'm just using 2 different decorative colored threads. You don't have to use 2 different colored threads, but sometimes, depending upon the technique that you're working with, it does give a very interesting look and effect. So I do have my needle in the left sewing position, and I'm going to simply engage the threading tubes, pull the length of thread, place my foot on the foot pedal. You probably are wondering, how are you getting the thread through there? So I'm simply stepping on the foot pedal, which creates the suction and it pulls the thread right through the machine. Super easy and fast with that, even with decorative thread. So now that we have this set, I can leave the threads positioned in the machine And with air threading, you can thread your machine in absolutely any order. So close up the doors, and I still am set with a 3-thread overlock stitch. My stitch length is increased already, so I wouldn't have to make an adjustment to that. Then I'm going to simply lower my presser foot, and I am going to shorten my stitch length just a little bit too, so you can see how that is going to look. Okay, so can you see how beautiful that stitch looks, whether it's a little farther apart, a little longer stitch length, or how the stitch length being closer together? One thing that I've done also is used that as a decorative stitch on the edge of a binding. So here I've taken my binding strip. Let me just unpin this for you. Here's my binding strip, 2.5-inch width of binding, simply folding it in half and stitching on the folded edge of your fabric strip. Okay? We're going to take a look at one other technique here, and it's adding our binding. We've talked about the piecing. We looked at quilt as you go, and I'm going to share with you real quick here on how you can attach your bindings. Now, when you attach your bindings, you again can use either the overlock stitch or you can use a chain stitch. I'm going to show you using an overlock stitch because I'm also going to use another different thread. This thread is a fusible thread. The thread itself is made of a fiber that when we heat it, it's going to join together with the other layers of fabric. So I'm going to always use this in my lower looper. Okay? So I'll replace the thread, decorative thread that I have, and you could again either use a 3-thread or a 4-thread stitch when you do this. I'm going to use a 3-thread stitch because that's what I have it set up for right now. The difference being, if you like to have your binding that has more fullness to it, you would use a 3-thread stitch. If you like your binding to be completely flat, then you would use a 4-thread stitch because that extra needle that's there is going to help condense the seam allowance and flatten out the thickness that you would have with your batting, your layers of binding, and with the layers of quilting fabric that you would have there. So again, I'll just simply remove the thread from my upper and lower looper, position the fusible thread in the lower looper, engage for threading, send the thread through, and we'll do the same thing with the upper looper thread. This time, the upper looper thread will just be the standard overlock thread. And we'll send that through as well. All right, so there you are. Close this up, bring it back to stitching. And I am going to widen my width just a little bit. I like to have a little wider seam allowance. And if I'm going to be using the decorative stitch, I will place, and I'm going to determine for our project here, we're going to determine that this is the right side of our project. This would be the back. So we're going to position the right side of our binding, the right side of the binding, to the wrong side of your project, okay? Simply lay this underneath your presser foot, lower the foot, and as we stitch, we're going to be stitching. And I'm going to reset this to the standard stitch length setting. And what I'm also going to do is make sure that my needle rests in the down position. So when my needle stops in the down position, I can then reposition and make sure my binding is going to be positioned properly as I stitch. So then simply stitch right on the edge. You can skim the edge of your fabric as you stitch. But every time you stitch, or anytime you stitch this, use this technique, always have your binding on the top side, and I'll show you why in just as soon as we turn this corner. Okay. So the needle stops down, and we want to come right to 1/4 of an inch. All right, we want to stop with the needle up, pivot our fabric out of the way, and stitch off. Okay, so you've finished about 1/4 of an inch from the end of the seam. So you're going to fold it back on itself, again, so that, let me lay this down so you can see it, so that you've created your 45-degree angle miter, fold it back on itself, and then fold it so that the end where you stitched off, where you first stitched, is lined up with the folded edge. And then we're simply going to pivot and stitch down the other side. So I'm going to raise the foot, slide that up right ahead of the needle, and again we can lower our needle, set it to stay in the down position. Okay, isn't that cool? And now I can reposition the fabric just as I need it. And I'm just going to stitch right off the end for this corner. Because what I'd like to show you is how we're going to turn this binding over. So we're going to take the seam allowance and we're going to press it up toward, well, not press it, because remember it has fusible thread. We're finger pressing. We're going to finger press that seam allowance and then simply turn the binding over. Turn the binding over, and then I'm going to give it a nice press with my iron, and that's going to hold it in place. All right, so didn't you love that decorative binding? So we're going to do the same thing and show you how to add your binding, your standard binding on a quilt. Remember, we looked at this and we determined this was our right side, this being our wrong side. So whether you like to have your binding wrap from the front to the back or from the back to the front, it really doesn't matter. But what you want to do always is have your binding on the opposite side you are wrapping it to. I prefer to have my binding wrap from front to back, so I'm going to position my binding on the front. Let me raise my needle, and I simply tap the back of the foot pedal, and that raises the needle up. I can slide the fabric right underneath the presser foot, and again I'm going to stitch all the way down to the end. You can lower your needle down and actually go stitch by stitch until you get to that 1/4 of an inch setting. Raise the needle up, raise your foot, and stitch off. All right, then again we're going to fold our binding back to create the 45-degree miter, fold it back on itself, pivot to turn your corner. So again, you have your seam allowance where you have your fusible thread in the lower looper, and we're just going to turn the binding over the edge, and with it being fusible, it's going to hold it in place. And that creating a really nice binding. And again, because this is of 3 thread, your binding is going to be a little more lofty. If you're wanting a 4 thread, using a 4 thread stitch, it'll be more condensed and flat. So let's come on over here and I'll show you how we're going to press this. So let's start with the standard binding. So we have our fusible thread in the lower looper, and I'm simply going to take the binding, fold it over the edge, take the iron, rest it on top, give it a good press. Love the steam that we have there with our Laurastar, and that's going to help hold it in place. And when you create your miter on the corner, find the side that has the, on your miter, use the underside and fold it under first. So see how this side has already held, it's already holding in place. Okay, we'll just rest that down. And then fold your miter and press it in place. Now I get asked all the time, how is that going to be secure enough? Is that going to be secure enough to hold your binding in place? You do want to stitch this and top stitch it in place to hold it. That fusible thread is strong enough to hold it, a temporary hold, until you would come back and you would stitch it again in place. But what it does prevent you from having to do is put a whole bunch of clips around the outside or use pins to hold your binding until you either hand stitch it or sew it by the machine. The same thing with the decorative binding. This time, when you do your decorative binding, you're just simply going to press the seam, press the decorative edge over the seam so that as you stitch, you're going to be stitching right next to that decorative line of stitching with your sewing machine, okay? When you're pressing with the decorative thread, also make sure that you have either a press cloth or you have a protective shoe on the iron itself. Because the decorative thread could be a little more fragile and it could melt depending upon the kind of thread that you're going to be working with. So then simply fold your mitered corner and give it a nice press to hold it in place. And again, when you come back, you will top stitch right next to that decorative line of stitching to hold it in place. Okay, that was easy, wasn't it? So you can see how you're going to be able to do your stitching, your piecing, I should say. You can also add your bindings. You can create your entire quilt on your overlock machine. Now you might also wonder, how do you do this decorative line of crosshatch stitching? That can also be done on your overlock machine. Simply changing it to a chain stitch will certainly give you that decorative option, but you can also use your chain stitch as we showed you earlier for actual piecing. So when we move from an overlock stitch to a chain stitch, you may find that you don't remember how to do that. But one thing that you'll find on the 890 is that we can go into our guided mode. And through this guided mode, being able to select the chain stitch, it will lead us through step by step on how to make the change from one stitch to another, and it actually does make the tension change and adjustment for you. Okay, this time we're still going to be using the same threading path, but this time we're going to be going over to the cover stitch needles. So we'll come over to the cover stitch sewing area, but I still use the same path. Oh, my needle's in the down position, so all I have to do is tap on my foot pedal and it brings it up to the sewing position. I'll move my needle from the overlock position over to the cover stitch. And I like to use the center needle position for that. And we'll remove the extra needle that we had for the 4-thread overlock. Just stick it right in that little needle pad. Now you do not want to cut with this, but you can if you want to. Lower your cutting blade, and we're going to lower the upper looper. Simply turn the knob and step on the back of your foot pedal, and it will disengage the upper looper. I'm going to bring this back out of guided mode, back into expert mode, and select my chain stitch. Now when I'm threading, and once I have the needle threaded, what you're going to do is look at the markings that are on the toe of the presser foot as your guides. So when we stitch with a chain stitch, it's a simple straight line of stitching. When I look at the position that my needle is in, you'll see that all of these guides or marks that are on the toe of the presser foot line up with each needle. And the center needle is the one that I'm working with. So if I want a 1/4 inch stitch, what I will do, and I know kind of from memory, but I could take my seam gauge and I could lay this down and I could see which guide I would want to use on the toe of the presser foot for my seam allowance. So I know that I would skip guide number 3 and I would guide the edge of my fabric with number 4. So I'll simply place a standard overlock thread in the chain looper. And wow, the chain looper thread comes right out here in the inside part of the door, easy to access and see. Now, when I'm going to be working with the chain stitch, I have the flat sewing table placed on, and you'll notice that it has these different markings or guides that you could use for a different seam allowance or width. But as we were stitching with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and keep in mind I'm not sitting right in front of the presser of the machine. So as I stitch, I'm going to be using the 4th mark that's on the toe of the presser foot as my guide. All right, so there you go. Now you have your 1/4 inch stitch that you've created using the chain stitch and using the markings that are on the toe of the presser foot. Another way to create that cross hatching, as I mentioned, is to take your layers of fabric, and because you're stitching in the middle of your fabric and you have this grand sewing space, you can simply stitch to create random lines of stitching on your fabric. Whether it's going to be spaced 2 inches, or you're going to be creating some decorative lines of stitching on your fabric. Like you would see on this bag. Or simple wavy lines of stitching right here on the side. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed learning some new tips and tricks along the way using your serger or overlock, whatever you call it, on your quilting projects. Stop by your authorized Bernina dealer to see this brand new machine and get some great information about how you can join that club.
Thank you for tuning in today, for stepping into the future of quilting with Pam Mashi. And welcome, Pam, to our live Q&A. We're excited to have you today joining us for the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show.
Well, great, Deanna. Thanks for having me. It's been really quite an adventure, I think, for all of us getting into this whole virtual world, and I'm just really glad to be part of it.
And we are glad to have you here, and we're glad to have so many viewers tuning in and watching, and they're asking questions about your techniques, Pam. So I'll share some of those with us. I have my laptop here, and we're watching comments. And the first comment is from Kelly. What do you do with the thread tails when you're serger quilting?
Well, Kelly, thanks for your question. And there are a couple different ways that you can treat those serger tails, and it really depends on where the tails would be. If the tails are going to be crossed over with another line of stitching, you really don't have to worry much about them because they're going to lock themselves in place. If the tail is always going to be exposed, or what we might call live, you could either thread that tail back in, or you could put just a small bit of seam sealant, fray check, fray block, place that right on the very edge. Always let it dry before you actually cut it off, especially with a decorative thread. If you cut it too soon, the tail will start to unravel and come apart. So always take the tail, put a dab of seam sealant, fray block, fray check on there, let it dry, and then you can cut it very close.
Good advice, Pam. And Jan is asking, do you leave both needles in when stitching a 3-thread when you switch from a 4-thread to the 3-thread?
Well, thanks, Jan. And most of the time, I'm going to only use one needle. And of course, that will be dependent on what width of or which needle position you're going to use. If you're using the left needle as a 3-thread stitch, keep in mind that that right needle is still going to continue to stitch through the middle of your overlock stitch. And if you're using a decorative thread, it could split the thread. The right needle could split the thread as it would go and puncture the thread as it would be stitching using only the left needle position. So typically I would always remove the opposite needle that I would not be using in a 3-thread stitch. But I may not have done that in my video. So do as I say, not as I do.
And Pam, Doris is asking, is your knife out of the way, or are you actually slicing off a little bit of batting and fabric when you're doing serger piecing?
So typically, Doris, and everyone out there too, when you're going to be doing like a quilt as you go, I will always leave my blade in the cutting position and just simply skim the edge. It kind of neatens up the edge, tidies up the edge. But also, you may notice on the video, when you look closely at the presser foot, there are markings that I refer to as needle position markings. But also there's a guide or a mark that's on the foot that actually aligns with your cutting blade. So you could align your fabric appropriately and not trim off too much so that your seam allowances would always be accurate and consistent, I should say.
Sure. And Chris has a similar question about when you're doing piecing on the serger. Chris is saying, I'm concerned that the blade may trim off fabric in some areas if my stitching is uneven and making my strips uneven.
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that when you're guiding your fabric in, even when you would be guiding in at your sewing machine, you want to have a consistent seam allowance. So you notice that there's a seam guide that can be placed on the machine, and there you could use that to guide the edge of your fabric, and it's going to be consistent. It's also, again, important to use those markings that are on your presser foot and guide along with the edge. If you trim away too much fabric, then yes, of course, it's going to be trimming away too much, and you wouldn't want to do that if you're stitching.
Sort of when we're piecing with our traditional piecing on our sewing machine, that's why we're so careful to make our scant
Right.
quarter inch and use our quarter inch presser foot and carefully guide our seams so that we have those even seams and have those even pieces. So it's much like that, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And what you can also do is, if so many times speed, when we work with an overlock, it goes so very fast, and you can adjust your speed on the machines so that you can sew a little bit more slowly if you're going into a specific area and wanting more control on your fabric strips.
And Mary on Facebook is asking, does the machine that you're using in your presentation have differential feed?
Yes, it does. And the machine I was using is the Bernina L890, and that machine has it controlled from the computer screen. So you can control the amount of differential feed that you're working with, as well as your stitch length right there on the screen.
Very nice. And Susan is asking, do you have a video that explains and demonstrates the seam guide?
Yes, if you go to the Bernina website, it does have a video there on showing how that seam guide is going to work. And then also, after this, I'm going to be going over to Linda Z's booth. So if you're wanting to see something more specific, you can log in, and I think Deanna's going to share with you how to do that in just a minute. And I can certainly share more information specific to the machines for you.
Sure, and you'll find that link at quiltshow.com when we're done with the live Q&A today, and that's where you'll find the Linda Z's booth, where Pam will be answering live questions over there when we're finished here. And Pat says, good morning from Portage, Wisconsin. What is the benefit or advantage to using fusible thread in the looper when applying your binding?
You know, I consider myself a non-traditional quilter. So binding was always something that I found a little more challenging or difficult. And I really like to use the fusible thread for stitching my binding in place. And then when you wrap it around to the opposite side, whether front to back or back to front, your preference, the fusible thread is going to hold your binding in place. And sometimes when you stitch, some of us prefer to stitch our binding by hand, others on the sewing machine. And either way, if you're holding your quilt and you have a lot of bulk, your binding is held in place. You don't have to worry about pins, you don't have to worry about clips to hold the binding, and it's all fused, and I like also a very flat binding, and it helps condense that binding edge and keep my corners actually much flatter with less bulk as well.
Very innovative, Pam. Deborah is asking, what is the narrowest 4-3 seam possible with your serger overlock machine?
So if you're asking, Deborah, if you're asking a four thread stitch or a 3-thread stitch, I think there's two different questions there. So the narrowest on using all 4 threads, that would be using your needle in the left position, is going to be 5 millimeters. And then the narrowest using the right needle will be even down to like 2 millimeters wide, depending upon if you're using it with the rolled hem setting or if you're going to be using it in a flat 3-thread overlock setting. But it goes up as wide as 9 millimeters too. So if we want to look at how narrow, we want to look at how wide. 9 millimeters wide is really very decorative too.
It's quite a range compared to the sergers that came out, 30 years ago. So
absolutely.
Possibilities.
Way easier to use too.
Well, Pam, we thank you for joining us today, and we thank everybody for tuning in. And Pam, you mentioned you'll be over at the Linda Z's booth after our live Q&A today. So thank you for joining us today, Pam.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure being here. Great to see you and be with all of you. Hopefully next year we can see you all again in person.
And so great to see you. And I know there's many more questions we didn't get to today. So be sure to head over to quiltshow.com enjoy that virtual vendor mall, explore everything that Quilt Show has to offer at quiltshow.com, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Dee.